The Boy with a Pig's Face by Paul McCann. One cold winter's night in a prison cell, a wheelchair was rolled out into the corridor. The woman who sat in the wheelchair was about to give birth. The woman in the wheelchair was taken down to the ground floor of the prison where the hospital wing was situated. It was dimly lit in the delivery room, and then soon arrived a small baby boy. As the groans and the moans accompanied the pains of the childbirth, and so did the loud screams of horror as they echoed through the entire prison. The baby that had just been born had the face of a pig. The midwife stood in shock as the mother sat up and started to laugh like a crazy animal. Three nurses ran and held the mother as the doctor gave her a sedative. The midwife took the child and placed it on a steel table. They began to wash him over with a bucket of cold water and a sponge. The child seemed healthy and there was no sign of stress. The sound of the wild wind cut through the empty brick holes of the hospital walls as the midwife wrapped the baby up in a prison towel. She looked into the baby's face and she said, "Oh, what a horrible place to come into. The world, and you with a pig's face." That evening there was a lot of talk inside the prison about a certain building where people were being experimented upon by some mad scientist. In return they were paid cash. People outside the prison were aware of this madhouse and had often heard the screams coming from inside the old milk depot building there near the city waste depot and the dump. The talk of the baby with the pig's face spread very quickly all over Port Pitt town. Most other towns would have been shocked and appalled at this news, but no, not for the people of Port Pitt town. You would have had to be living there to understand why the news of the baby with the pig's face was dismissed so easily. It was said that most of the people at some time or another had been experimented with and that many had lost their sanity. Another thing was that the people had become hard and very cruel. You see, Port Pitt town was like most other merchant towns, hard and mean. Everything was hard in this old place, this old cold place where the rain fell hard and turned into sleet before it hit the cobblestones on the street. Heads were hard and hearts were hard, and even the beds were hard, and the bread was hard, and work was hard to find. Fists were hard, and a friend even harder to find. People said Port Pitt town was the hardest place to live in the whole world. Those who had made it home were mainly business people who tried to scrape a living out from the pig's back. There was no hope for the sick or the old. There was not much charity for the poor, and most of the children never smiled. Their lives were hard. A stranger always stood out because they often smiled and handed out copper coins to the beggars on the street. One morning before the sun rose, a woman carrying a child left the prison. As the woman raced through the streets, some of the market men shouted, "Aye, look, it's the boy with the pig's face!" The woman ran along through the cobblestone streets, holding her baby tightly, as a small crowd chased after her. She stepped into the doorway of a butcher's shop. "Oh, God help me," she said. A hand reached out and grabbed her and pulled her inside the shop. With his hand over her mouth, they watched in silence as the crowd run past the shop. The man clung on to the woman and said, "I promise I won't hurt you." He proceeded to lift the cloth that had half covered the baby's face, and he looked long and hard at the pig's face that he saw. The butcher's face was filled with grief as he turned to the woman and said, Do you love him? She nodded her head. Yes, I do, the butcher said. Poor unfortunate child. As if life wasn't hard enough around here. The woman nodded in agreement and said, My name is Eileen, and the baby is Luke. The butcher took down a blade from the rack and lifted it above the child. The woman never flinched an eye. The butcher then threw the knife at a side of beef hanging by the cool room. The knife landed right between the eyes of the dead cow. Make your home with me, said the butcher. Years passed, and Luke Green grew up with abuse and constant rejection. He was the brunt of others' shame, and took many's a kicking and punching for his troubles. Eventually, as a young man, people got used to seeing him around, and they gave up their tactics of hatred and punishment. Luke got a job in the prison, where he was paid to get rid of the rubbish. One day, as he was dumping a barrow of rubbish, Luke was found by a visitor to the town. Excuse me, young man. I seem to have lost my way. Could you tell me where the docks are? Luke turned to point the way, and the well-dressed man saw his face. After the initial shock, the man asked Luke a few questions. Then he asked if he could examine his face. He spoke with Luke for a while and told him he would meet him again. After a few visits to Port Pitttown, this kind stranger became Luke's friend and told him of the day to come that he was going to change his life. And that day came like a new beginning of a miracle. Eileen and Luke were taken away from Port Pitttown, and both of them were placed into the care of Hopetown Hospice. There for the next 7 years, plastic surgery and research was given to Luke free of charge by this kind stranger who called himself Luke's friend. When Luke had resembled the appearance of a normal human being again, it was revealed that this kind man was the brother of the mad scientist who had tormented and disfigured the lives and the faces of hundreds of people in his crazy plan to become a recognized genius of his time. When this plan seemed bound to failure, the mad scientist had killed himself and left some scattered records of his experiments. The first of many was that of Luke, whose life had now been set right. The end.